Welcome back, guys. All right, so today we're going to take the next step towards writing our papers that argue or debate why we should come back to school in person or we should stay at school virtually. And today we're going to look at quotations, and we're going to do this in a foldable format that's going to look something like this, and why we should ice our quotations. Introduce, cite, explain. All right, why we should ice our quotations. And this is the metaphor that I like to use. Think of your essay as a hot day. All right, it's hot. You're sweating. It's just miserable, right? And what is great on a hot, miserable day? Something to drink. You just want something tasty, delicious, right? You got a tasty, delicious beverage. Well, that tasty, delicious beverage are your quotations because it helps on a hot day, right? But if that beverage is hot itself, it doesn't help anything. So you take the ice, and that makes your beverage even better on a hot, miserable day, which is your essay. So we're going to talk about how to ice your quotations, what exactly that means, and we're going to do it in foldable form. Now, I did my foldable in in different colors, as you're going to see when we go to the next board. But I took the notes for I in a color, C in a color, and E in a color. So let's move over to the next board. And we're going to start with the I. The I, which is to introduce your quotations. Now, there's 4 ways to introduce your quotation. 1, you can do it with a complete sentence. Just a complete sentence that says, for example, it could be like, let's take Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. And you introduce that whole complete sentence. You want to take a quote out of that speech. You want to put it in your paper, and you give a whole sentence that introduces it, because you never want a quote to sit by itself. And so you could say, in his I Have a Dream speech, Dr. Martin Luther King had a dream. That's a complete sentence. But you're going to add this colon right here, and then you put the quote or the line from that and keep it moving. All right, you put the quote from the speech that you want after that sentence via colon. You could also have an explanatory phrase, something that just kind of introduces what's coming on. All right, what's coming up. You know, Dr. Martin Luther King gave us his famous I Have a Dream speech, where he said, and then end it with a comma, put your quote. Because again, you never want that quote to stand alone and stand by itself. You can also take short portions of that quote, and you want 2 to 4 words, 2 to 4 word phrases. All right, nothing long and drastic, but you just introduce what he was talking about, take the 2 to 4 words summary or 2 to 4 word quote, put it right there. And I'm going to give you examples of these when we are done. But you use short quotes, 2 to 4 word phrases. You're going to see exactly how to do that when we go to the PowerPoint. But I want you to understand what you can do first. Your 4th step or your 4th option is to paraphrase. You begin your statement in your own words, and then you end it with the quote. You begin it in your own words, paraphrase what the first part of that says, and then you end it in your own words. All right, now we're going to go to the C part, the cite part. This is the part that most of you do not like to do. And that is citing where your quote came from. And we're going to do this via in-text citations, okay? And I'm going to try to make this as simple and as easy to understand as possible. So in your sentence, right, you have one of your 4 introductions to your quote, right? So you introduce your quote, then you give your quote. At the end, you're going to put your citation and the period, right? Well, the citation should be the author's last name of whatever you're using and the page number it came from. The author's last name, the page number it came from. Now, then you should have a works cited page. I'm going to make this very simple for you. EasyBib.com will create the works cited page for you. You just have to put the information in there. All right, so we're not going to go super in depth back to how I used to have to do it, where I had to go find publication dates and authors and done. EasyBib.com. You put in the information, it's going to put it in the correct order and tell you what exactly it should look like. All right, so that is the cite part. Introduce your quote, give your quote, in the end, parentheses, author's last name, page number, period. That is your citation portion. The E is the most important part. We got to explain. What we don't want is a quote that is just sitting there all alone by itself. So you have to explain why that quote is relevant to what you are teaching. And so you're providing analysis. You are analyzing that quote. You are connecting it to your main idea, which in our essay is, should we go back to school? Should we not? You find the quote. You're going to explain how that quote proves your main idea, whichever side of the debate you are on. And you can do this through sentence starters like this proves, this shows, the difference is. All of these are sentence starters that will help you connect to your main idea. So you got to connect it to your main idea. You need to explain why that quote is important or relevant. Why, of all the things you could have quoted, you picked that. This is important because. This is relevant because. All kinds of sentence starters for that too. But not only are you connecting it to your main idea, but you're explaining why of everything from that article you could have quoted, you picked that quote. And lastly, you want to make sure it supports your main idea. You should be able to explain in multiple sentences how this quote goes with what you are arguing or trying to explain. And so this is the ICE method. The ICE method of citing. Because again, a quote should never ever stand alone. It should never stand by itself. Now, I'm going to turn this PowerPoint on. We're going to look at some examples here. All right. Once my projector decides it wants to work appropriately. We're going to move this over here. And so, like I said, a quotation should never, ever stand alone. You should never just have a paragraph and then bam, a quote right there. It doesn't work that way. It cannot stand all on its own. All right, you should always explain your quote. You should begin a sentence with a quote. It shouldn't stand there all by itself. You should be able to explain your quote and properly cite that quote. And like I said, you use the ICE method. Use the ICE method to do this. So the I, again, as we talked about, is introducing your quote. And so we're going to look at this quote from Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech. Again, I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. All right, and now I'm going to show you those 4 different ways to introduce using the same quote. All right, so introducing in a complete sentence. Like I said, in his I Have a Dream speech, Dr. Martin Luther King had a dream. That by itself alone could be a sentence. But you add this colon and then boom, you can put the quote, which we just talked about. I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day, etc., etc. But you can also, like we said, introduce it with an explanatory phrase, beginning with a phrase that introduces the quote, okay? In his famous I Have a Dream speech, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, comma, and then you tell what he said. These are the ways to put that entire quote. If you want to put the entire quote, you have to introduce it in one of those 2 ways. But then you have the 2 additional ways which don't require you to add the entire quote. You can use short quotes. All right, 2 to 4 sentence phrases, 2 to 4 word phrases. I'm sorry. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of a day when his children would only be judged by the content of their character. So what you did was you took that whole big long quote and you summarized it up top. You summarized what he dreamed of, who he was talking about, what he wanted, and then used the quote to explain what he wanted them to be judged by. 2 to 4 word phrase, boom, summarize the rest of the quote. And then your last option is to introduce your quote by paraphrasing it. And again, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. dreamed of a day when his 4 children would not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. So again, this is very similar to the short phrase versions, but you're paraphrasing the first half of the quote, but still using the entire second half of the quote. So that is the introducing your quote examples. The C, like we talked about, is citing your quote. And there's 2 ways to do it. We're going to look at MLA specifically. But like I talked about, you're going to introduce your quote. So that's your sentence starter. Give your quote, citation at the end, in parentheses, with your period after the citation. All right? So again, always introduce your quote. Never start a sentence like that. Use your parentheses so that we know when the quote begins. Use your quotation marks so we know when the quote begins. Use your parentheses so we know when the citation begins. All right? And then this is what I was talking about. There's all these different ways that you have to cite on your works cited page. But with EasyBib.com, you don't have to do that. You just plug in the information. And then this is explaining your quote. We talked about this. So let's go to an example. All right. Before the traffic lights invention, that's the introduction, comma, quotation mark, it was not uncommon for bicycles, animal-powered carts, and motor vehicles to share the same thoroughfares with pedestrians. Accidents frequently occurred between the vehicles. And then you'll see parentheses here, Federal Highway Administration. Close the parenthesis, period. Okay, so you have introduction, quote, citation. After the invention and implementation of the traffic light, the number of collisions was reduced and thus created a safer environment for automobile travel. Exclamation. Or explanation. Explanation. Whew. Speaking is hard. So you can see introduction, the quote, the citation, and the explanation all right there. So it got the point across very simply. And you can see what they're wanting to talk about. In the explanation, it explains why it was important. And so you're going to use this model and this method in your paper. So any quote that you give, you should introduce it, quote it, and then explain why that quote is important or relevant. And you should do this for each and every quote that you use. All right? So I'm going to open this back up for those of you that need to pause the video to see the full notes under the ICE method. You are going to have an assignment which involves picking out quotes from the articles that I gave you. You're eventually going to pick your own articles and have to pick quotes out of those as we continue to build this essay. But if you have any questions, reach out to me. And as always, you have a great day.